All statements and opinions expressed by guests of the Adult in the Room podcast are strictly their own and do not necessarily reflect the beliefs or opinions of the host, producers, or advertisers. All interviews are presented in their most complete possible form in the interests of free speech. No statements should be interpreted as financial, legal, or medical advice. Listener and viewer discretion are strongly advised.
It's the Adult in the Room podcast with Victoria Taft. That's me. Welcome to the Adult in the Room podcast. I'm Victoria Taft. You know, Don Bentley, he loves his country. He loves Van Halen. At least I think he does. He loves old movies. At least I think he does, like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Sure.
Loves his friend. Yep. Loves his wife, his family. And he's held the coolest and most dangerous jobs around. And now he has stepped into yet another pinch myself kind of job, stepping into the shoes of Vince Flynn, taking over writing America's favorite protagonist in the spy thriller genre, Mitch Rapp, after Kyle Mills guided the series after Vince died in 2013. Don Bentley, welcome back to the Adult in the Room podcast. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks so much for having me. And I love the shirt. I still can't get one of those, but you have
way.
one.
Cadet maker. No, Kyle Mills told me where to find it. And I said, that was the only time he ever answered me back. I keep trying to get him on my podcast. But, I was like, okay, dude, I'll just go with Don then. Fine. Which is awesome. Guess what's out?
Yes. Came out 2 weeks ago. We found out this week it hit number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list, which is pretty stinking awesome.
I mean, honestly, this is just amazing. When you eclipse the "it starts with us and it ends with us" books, you have made it, my friend. You have made it.
Love it. Love it. Anybody that can hang with Colleen Hoover must be doing something right. That's
the chick who wrote those? Okay. Well, good. I mean, I don't even know who writes it, but I'm glad that she's making a living and doing well. But I love Vince Flynn's books and I love your writing.
Thank you.
You did it.
Yes.
You did it.
Yes. It was crazy, because I'm such a big fan of his. I think you and I might have talked about this before, but I actually read a ton of his books while I was in Afghanistan because they have those little pop-up libraries everywhere, and so you could take a book or leave a book, and there were tons of his books there. And then when my second book didn't sell, I took my favorite Vince Flynn book, which was Protect and Defend, and diagram that thing out and taped it to our bedroom wall, and my wife loved that. She could wake up next to Vince every day. But I mean, all of that to now come full circle and be able to write in the universe he created is just incredible.
Here's the snapshot of the plot line from the book, and it reads, and I'll read it all. April 2011. On a remote mountaintop overlooking the remains of the Iranian nuclear power program, the weapons program, Azad Ashani witnesses a Quds Force demonstration of a capability meant to upend America's war in the Middle East. Ashani, director of the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security, and Irene Kennedy's former back channel to the Iranian government, recognizes the demonstration's true significance and the nation-ending conflict it will provoke. Alone, Ashani stands no chance of preventing this rush to madness. But with the help of one man, he just might. In Washington, D.C., CIA Director Irene Kennedy briefs the president that the operational window to kill or capture Osama Bin Laden at his recently discovered compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, is rapidly closing. But before he'll authorize a commando raid on Pakistani soil, the president demands irrefutable proof of bin Laden's presence and proof he must trust just to one man. Preventing a looming war in the Middle East while delivering justice for the nearly 3,000 Americans killed on 9/11 would be a big ask for anyone. Mitch Rapp isn't just anyone. Well, okay. Wow.
You're good at this. You should do this for a living. I would totally buy that book. I don't need anything else.
I only muffed up one sentence. which I'm sure you recognize. Okay, yeah. Okay, so tell me why you decided to go back in time
Yeah.
and put Mitch Rapp around the Bin Laden raid, and what would the CIA have been doing around that raid, Operation Neptune Spear, which was spearheaded, if you will, by JSOC as well as the Navy SEALs?
Yeah, so at its core, Capture or Kill answers the question that Vince Flynn fans have been asking for the last 13 years. And that question is, what role did Mitch Rapp play in the operation to capture or kill Bin Laden? And so I'm, like we talked about, I am first and foremost a Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp fan. And so in my mind, kind of Afghanistan and Vince were always tied together. And so in 2011, I was an FBI agent in Dallas, and I remember standing in my living room when President Obama walked out and said, "We finally got Bin Laden." And my first thought was, it's about freaking time. And then my second thought,
yes,
as a Mitch Rapp fan, was, I wonder what role Mitch had to play in it. And so when I got finally found out that I was going to get to write this iconic series, I wanted to go back and read Vince's books over and over and over again, because Kyle had done an incredible job, but I wanted to ground myself in the way that Vince wrote them, because I didn't want to start by writing something that was a derivative of a derivative. And so as I was reading those books, I noticed something really interesting. And so Vince aged Mitch in real time, which means that whatever year that book came out, that's how old Mitch was. And he would reference current events that happened in that year. And he did that up until Pursuit of Honor. And then he went back in time and wrote Mitch's origin story. And so he wrote 2 prequels. It's American Assassin and Kill Shot. And then he jumped.
My favorite.
Yeah, everybody loves Kill Shot. It's such a good freaking book. And then he jumped all the way forward in time and finished what was tragically his final book, that was The Last Man. And so when I was looking at that, I realized there was a gap about 3 or 4 years where nobody knew what Mitch Rapp was doing. And one of those was 2011. And so I thought, you know what would be really fun would be to go back in time and write the Mitch that Vince did, tie it into this iconic operation that we did, and then have Vince kind of be my training wheels, since he has the book on either side of mine, and really demonstrate to the fans how much I love this series. Now, I'm a kid of the 80s. I love Top Gun. I was really, really nervous when Top Gun Maverick came out, because I'm like, they're going to ruin this thing I love.
Yes.
And they didn't, right? I might have cried some man tears in the beginning where it showed, it was the Top Gun anthem again and all the planes. And so I really wanted this book to be my version of Top Gun Maverick, to go back to the era Vince wrote and to demonstrate to the fans how much I love this series too.
The plot line was heavily helicopter centric, and in some ways that's obvious. Well, some ways that's obvious because of what we know about the Bin Laden raid, but there might be another reason, Don Bentley. You piloted an Apache attack helicopter and or helicopter, from Boeing. I found a beauty shot of this thing. Look at that.
Doesn't that just bring tears to your eyes? Like, that might be the perfect machine ever built right there. It
would make a bad guy just shit his pants. Excuse me. that would be the result.
I think it has. It's not might. It has, Victoria.
Now, tell me about this. Tell me about this helicopter.
So it's an amazing aircraft, and you see the configuration they have right there. They have 2 rocket pods on either side, a bunch of Hellfire missiles, and then it has this amazing cannon that you can see is pointed to the lower left-hand corner, and that means that the pilot is looking that direction, because that gun is actually slave to your eye. And so whatever you look at, the gun points at, and then you squeeze the trigger and it goes away. And when it shoots, it's like this jackhammer in the front seat, and it shakes the whole helicopter. It's freaking amazing. And so since I flew Apaches in Afghanistan, I really wanted to show Army aviation is different than the other branches. So for instance, the Cobras and the Marines exist solely to support Marines on the ground. Army aviation, Apaches in particular, are treated more like big flying tanks. And so you actually go off and do your own missions. And I was a cavalry officer, so you would do a reconnaissance or a screen or something like that is completely independent perhaps from guys on the ground. And so I really wanted to show that in this book. And so there's a character in here named Kelsey Smith. Kelsey is one of my best friends. We were in Afghanistan together. And so I put him in the book because I might have had, he stayed in the Army and retired as a colonel after I got out. And I might have had to call him up during parts of this book when I was writing. And I'm like, now how does this go again? And, you know, he made fun of me for a little bit and then helped me out. And kind of a side note, in case you're wondering, the last time I flew an Apache was 2007. And for one of my Clancy books, I got to go back and fly the simulator again about 15 years later. And as I was going in that day, my wife's like, aren't you worried? And I'm like, nah, it's like riding a bike. I'll be fine. And Victoria, it is not like riding a bike. I'm here to tell you, I might have disgraced myself that day, but it was a ton of fun.
Did you crash one? Did you crash one?
Crash is a strong word. I mean, I might have gotten close to the ground. There's this funny thing. I was sitting in the front seat, and there's a control in the front seat, and there's one trigger that's your laser and one trigger is the weapon system. And so you use your laser to get the range. Well, people always make fun of you because if you pull the wrong trigger, you can have a loud laser, meaning you think you're going to shoot the laser and you shoot the gun instead. And it goes, "Caw, caw, caw, caw." And so I may have had a loud laser a time or two in the simulator and might have had to turn in my wings if it hadn't been 15 years later.
Here's a beauty shot from Boeing. Some B-roll for us here on the Adult in the Room podcast. Listen to this.
Oh yeah, and just right there, it just makes you want to go down to the recruiting station right now and just sign up. Just sign up. Though I will say the Navy got that magnificent movie Top Gun, and we got a train wreck called Firebirds that has Nicolas Cage, and it is every bit as awful as the title might suggest. And that's what they made about Apaches.
Oh, is that right? Oh, yes. Lord.
Yes.
Look at that. Don't you want to buy one now?
I mean, for a cool $35 million, you could have one, Victoria.
Yep. Thank you, Boeing. That might be the last thing Boeing's built recently. It's doing okay.
They're having a tough time. They're having a tough time.
Whoa. And they build the Chinooks too. And one of the other things I didn't realize, I'm Boeing family. What do I know? But we don't do, my family pays more attention to, the passenger jets and all that stuff as opposed to the defense side. But there is another helo that matters greatly in capture or kill. May I just present this again? And that is the Chinook helicopter, also made by Boeing. And we got a couple of videos here. Tell me a little bit, when you see this photo, what do you see?
So the Chinook is really interesting because it's actually the fastest helicopter in the Army inventory, and you wouldn't know it by looking at it because it looks like a big flying dump truck. But it is, and when you go to Afghanistan or you go to combat the first time, there's a lot of good-natured or maybe not so good-natured ribbing that takes place between pilots. In fact, I'll tell you a joke, and it's a Black Hawk joke, but it works for Chinooks too. And so the joke is, why do Chinook pilots sit side by side? Do you know the answer to that?
No.
It's so they can hold hands when they're getting scared. So that's one of the jokes. Now, I will say that once you deploy to combat and the first time you see a Chinook that is hovering on the side of the mountain with only its ramp touching the mountain so guys can run in and out, then you quit making jokes about them. And so in the book, there's actually a special kind of Chinook. It's called an MH-47, which is the heavily modified version that the Army 160th, the Army Special Operations Regiment flies. And you can normally tell if it's a 160th Chinook because they'll often have the big refueling probe at the end of it. And so this one doesn't have that. It could be that the refueling probe was taken off, but they're pretty, looks like a huge big spear on the front of the nose that allows them to actually refuel in flight, which is pretty crazy.
Now, you've got one in the book, and you said it was operated by the 160th. So it has a little bit of extra stuff that goes with it. And I don't want to spoil it, but does that ATV actually exist?
Yeah, so I give a little hint to something that's called an M-Razor, which is used quite a lot now by special operations folks. And so it's kind of a 4-seater, not really a dune buggy, kind of maybe a cross between a dune buggy and a 4-wheeler. And so it is incredibly fun to drive around with, and they can put all kinds of crazy weapons on it, and you can put it in the back of a Chinook, and so you actually see those go shooting out of the Chinooks, and I got to show that in Capture or Kill.
Your description is spellbinding, and don't miss that, because that was one of those things it's one of those things. Well, I know you were in Spooksville and you created some of these gadgets and stuff like that for the military as well as special forces folks on the ground. And so I just thought, is that real? I mean, I could have looked it up, but I thought, well, I'll ask you.
It is real, and it's really fun, and I've gotten to see quite a few of them.
So here's a video. I just wanted one more video. Here's a Chinook, and I just want you to describe it for me. It's just a few seconds long, and see if you feel you're lucky.
But I know what's happening here. Yeah. So one of the incredible things about a Chinook is that he's going low level. What I thought you were going to see is they can actually bring the Chinook down and flood the back of it, and those boats can drive up into the Chinook. It's incredible. And
no
they'll
way.
It's really, really neat to see. They'll come down, lower the ramp, flood it, and that little Zodiac, or whichever the boat is that'll have Navy SEALs or sometimes Army Rangers or something, will actually drive up into the back of the helicopter, and then it'll take off and go. It's pretty incredible.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the Chinooks are also... Oh, go ahead. No, go.
No, I was going to say the 160th folks were actually the first ones, I believe, to fly into Afghanistan with the horse soldier guys, because they were the only ones that could get up high enough to get across the mountain ridges and then down into the other side. So they're pretty incredible helicopters.
It's been a while since I've read that book. I was absolutely captivated by that horse soldier's book, the whole tale of that. And then, of course, the Chinook comes into closer scrutiny in this book, as well as, of course, in the real world. You look at that big one, the Chinook, carry a lot of men, but you wonder, should it carry that many men?
Yeah, it's awful. When a Chinook crashes or is shot down, there's an astronomical amount of casualties for that, because it carries so many people. And so when we were in Afghanistan, we didn't lose any Apaches to enemy fire. We had 2 that folks overflew the environment and ended up crashing the helicopter, but they weren't shot down. Our sister unit had a Chinook that was shot down by an RPG, and unfortunately there's been a history of that, right, where you go back to my own experience during Operation Red Wings, where Turbine 33 was shot down by an RPG, to fast forward a couple years later to the tragedy that was Extortion 17, where it was another Chinook shot down by an RPG. And so they're very vulnerable when they're hovering and or when they're coming in for landing, which is why almost all the operations, if they can, are done at night. Now, both of those 2 shoot downs I just mentioned happened during the daytime, and because there were troops in contacts, and so the Navy SEALs were trying to get to their buddies and save them. But there are definitely trade-offs, like they can move. So part of what you look at from an aviation perspective is how quickly can you get combat power onto the landing zone. And so the great thing about a Chinook is you can fill that thing up with Army Rangers or Navy SEALs or whatever, which means when it comes in, you have a whole lot of combat power on the landing zone very quickly. But the downside to that, obviously, is that you can lose a lot of guys if, God forbid, the thing is shot down.
I mean, that figures prominently in your book, and it's a pivot point, a huge plot point in Capture or Kill. What can you tell us about it? And tell us, if you can, what you were using as inspiration, if you will, for your scenes. And also, how deeply did you go into the Operation Neptune Spear, the attempt to get Bin Laden, and the CIA's creating or at least preparing the battlefield in advance? Tell us how you found all that stuff out and what you used and what was real.
Sure. Yeah. So to answer your question, the first one first. So when I was the first one first, the threat in Afghanistan and Iraq was very different, and for aviation in particular. And so in Iraq, there were a whole lot more proliferation of shoulder-fired missiles, and so it's actually really, really hard to hit a helicopter with an RPG if it's moving, because you have to. You're firing, a dumb bullet, and so if the helicopter is moving at 120 or 130 miles an hour, and you're trying to shoot it as it's going by, you actually have to lead it by 200 or 300 meters or something to be able to do it. Conversely, if you have a shoulder-fired missile, those lock on to the heat signatures usually of the helicopter's engines, or the more advanced ones can actually target, the sun's reflection off the helicopter, things like that. And so in Iraq, they were a lot more prominent, and there were several high-profile shootdowns to the point where Chinooks for a while were not allowed to fly during the daytime. They were only flying at night in Iraq. And in fact, I had a guy I served with, Rex Kenyon, who was killed in Iraq, where his Apache was shot down by a shoulder-fired missile. In Afghanistan, there was always the rumor of what they called stingers, because we gave the Mujahideen all of these stingers in their fight against the Russians. And so there was always the rumblings of so-and-so's got a stinger, so-and-so. Now, the intelligence folks would go back and forth and say, hey, by now the batteries that power the Seeker are probably dead. Even if he's got it, it's hanging on his wall somewhere. And so to my knowledge, in the eastern side of Afghanistan where I was, it was only rocket-propelled grenades. Now, there was some stuff on the western side of Iraq where the British thought they might have gotten shot down, and they actually interdicted some Iranian-sponsored militia groups that were moving into Afghanistan with shoulder-fired missiles. And so what I did was kind of combine those two things as a threat and say, what would Afghanistan look like if shoulder-fired missiles had been more prominent? And more in particular, shoulder-fire missiles that could track a target at night, which is very, very hard to do, because when you're the gunner, you have a very narrow field of view that you as the gunner for that missile have to be able to track a helicopter with to get it to lock on, and it's much more difficult to do at night. Jumping to your question about Operation Neptune Spear, so there were a lot of I knew going into it that the Bin Laden raid was going to be kind of the metronome that was driving the entire book. But I also, when you write, and this is not by any means historical fiction, but it certainly incorporates a historical event, you have to be very careful that historical event doesn't overshadow the plot in your book. And so I knew that Mitch Rapp was not going to be fast roping with the SEALs onto the compound. And so I had to decide, what are the things that he could do in this book that still applied and would still keep it interesting. And so I did a lot of research into how the CIA was able to determine or make their best guess that Bin Laden was there, and then some of the things that they did to try and get a certainty, and so one of them was they actually sponsored, pretty famously, a doctor to go in and be able to give injections, with the thought being that they would be able to take DNA samples and do a familiar, correspondence to see if he was there or not. And so there are a lot of those really neat stories about ways that the CIA or other intelligence operations or agencies rather, set the battlefield conditions for that. And I certainly, it is not I didn't take it verbatim, but there are certainly some of those that came to play in Capture or Kill.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Really, really well done. There's a reason that there are a lot of helicopters in there, because because of course, obviously you piloted many, and you even have the Bell Jet Ranger in there too. So I mean, you're very ecumenical in your choices of helicopters. You talk about, as we move along in the book a little bit, you talk about nation building on page 232. And it's Scott Coleman, of course, who's a fantastic aide-de-camp, if you will, of Mitch Rapp. And so it's these guys having a little chit-chat after they meet a couple of real losers who are now working with the military to nation build in Afghanistan. I really think we're going to lose this thing, Rapp said, turning to Coleman. What? Our chance to find the Quds Force officer? Rapp. The war, Scott, the whole war. The special operations boys and girls across the street are still getting after it, but the jihadis aren't going to be crushed by spies and snake eaters alone. Look, I'm all for having a local populace giving them a reason to support us, but we've got leaders who think it's better to use our soldiers' time to build schools instead of killing shitbags. And how hard was that for you to see?
Yeah, it was really hard. I served in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2006. So it was 4 to 5 years after the initial invasion. And even then, and I was a junior officer, and so I was certainly not privy to the discussions that went on for, national strategic goals. But even from my vantage point, you could see that we'd kind of reached a status quo where we were treading water and not quite sure what is it we're doing here, what is actually the end state. And so we got to be really good at prosecuting tactical targets. And in fact, the four SEALs, Mike Murphy and Marcus Luttrell and Danny Dietz and Matt Axelson, that were tragically killed, or three of the four of them were tragically killed during Red Wings. The guy they were going after was a mid-level Taliban guy, right? And so we were very good at going after tactical targets, but I think we had lost our way as a military and frankly, as a nation, of saying, what is our strategic goal at this point in Afghanistan? What are we actually trying to do here? Because certainly when you take a bunch of barrel-chested freedom fighters and send them to Afghanistan, they're going to find something to do. They're not going to sit there for a year and twiddle their thumbs. But at the same point, you're playing whack-a-mole and hitting all of these mid-level to low-level Taliban folks, and to what end? To what is the national strategy that actually says we get to a point where we exit Afghanistan or do something of that sort? And so I think you could see a little bit, but maybe when I was there at that time, you could see a whole lot more of it back when our withdrawal of Afghanistan happened, and it kind of crumbled around me. And so the fourth book in my Matt Drake series, Forgotten War, actually is written during that time because it just affected me so deeply. I kept getting these calls and texts and emails from fellow veterans saying, was it worth it? Was the blood, the tears, the brothers and sisters we left behind, the time we spent away from our family, the treasure we poured in for 20 years, and was any of it worth it? And I didn't really know how to answer that question. And so I was writing the book trying to figure it out. And so certainly that came across in Capture or Kill, because I think those were legitimate questions. And Vince himself, in The Last Man, which was tragically his final book before he died of cancer, even he had Rapp starting to ask those questions at that point. And so, yeah, it was hard. It was hard to write.
Your book, Forgotten War, your Matt Drake series, excellent book, just really takes that head on. And you're not overtly political. You are just, you're doing what Mitch Rapp would do. You're saying the words Mitch Rapp would say. But I do kind of wonder. So I've got, and I told you about the nation building, the contrast with Vietnam and Afghanistan. Then on page 212, you describe the Kabul airport in 2011 and how it's really busy and there are only 300 people that get in and out every single day. And I couldn't help but contrast that to leaving Bagram and then doing everything, all the escape stuff out of Kabul airport. That was,
it's tragic. The whole point of Bagram is that we had spent 20 years building a secure footprint around this massive airbase, right? And so if the decision had been, hey, we're going to leave Afghanistan, well, of course you do it from Bagram, because again, you had the infrastructure, the security necessary, the footprint to be able to control all of that. And so when it defaulted to Kabul, it was a tragedy. Those folks were killed, but certainly looking back, I think anybody can see that we were probably headed for that direction, that it was only a matter of when, not if, that a suicide bomber or a VBIED or something like that would be detonated next to the Americans there.
And you talk about the need for NVGs and the helicopter, and we left. How many did we leave behind? We left. Let's see. 160,000 radios and communication, 16,000 night vision goggles, 12,000 Humvees, 42,000 trucks, 1,000 armored vehicles, MRAPs, M16s, M4s. I mean, this is the big show by the Taliban. I guess it was last year when they laid all the stuff we left behind out there for everyone to be embarrassed by.
Yeah, and the night vision goggles especially, like what gave us the overmatch especially during the initial invasion in 2001 and such, is that we had the ability to operate at night and the Taliban did not. And so you had that completely one-sided technological advantage, to the point like that we were so good at it. When we would fly Apache helicopters, you would have guys on the ground with laser pointers, and my front seater would wear one on his hand, and they could actually point back and forth at a spectrum that the Taliban couldn't see and deconflict targets and stuff. Now you can't do any of that, right? Like, you have ceded the advantage that we have held for a long time. And that's not to say that night vision goggles aren't available commercially and stuff. They are. And in fact, and the same with drones. That's one of the crazy things that you've seen in the Ukraine war, is how much you can buy a $400 drone with a night vision device on it, but certainly not to the fidelity of the goggles and stuff that we had in Afghanistan. And we just gave them all away. It's absolutely heartbreaking.
There's one more thing I want to bring up before we go back to the book, and that is recent. I don't know if you watch the Sean Ryan podcast, but absolutely must see. He gives oral histories, or he has people on who lived through all this stuff and give their oral history of what happens as a person who writes a book who wants to get into the heads of the war fighters that you don't know. This might be a worthy place to look to get inside the heads of these guys. But he had recently had a former CIA gal on who picked targets and such, and now she's chasing down the money for the Taliban. And it turns out that, of course, in addition to sending Iran the shrink-wrapped monies from all over the world, we send a plane with $43 million to $87 million weekly to Afghanistan. 70% of the money siphoned off by the Taliban, NGOs, and now the NGOs have to have Taliban representation on their boards. So when the United States government says, "Oh, we're working with these great NGOs," no, they're not. They're working with what used to be maybe a great NGO, but not anymore, because now they're compromised. What a gut punch this is! What a gut punch! Unbelievable.
Yeah. I'm no kind of political savant, but it seems to me that we ought not be sending money to people that hate us. Like that seems like a pretty easy rule to institute. If you hate us and want to kill us, we're not going to send you money. Doesn't seem that hard to me.
Yeah, I get that. I've never asked you about this before, and I know that we're bumping up on the time limit that you've given us, and I know that when you left the Army, you eventually ended up at the FBI Dallas office as a SWAT officer because, you just wanted to quiet things down a little bit. You just didn't want to, no more conflict in your life. You wanted to chill out and stuff like that. But one of the things that happened when you were there, I've always wanted to ask you about. What were you doing the night of that horrible night in 2016 when that BLM guy mowed down 5 police officers killed, 9 others wounded, 2 citizens, non-combatants, if you will, hurt. Were you called out for that? Remember that?
So that was horrible, but it occurred after I left. So I left.
Did? Okay.
Yeah. I left Dallas, I think in 2012 or 2013. So it was a couple years after.
I thought you were still there. I thought you were still forgiven me.
Nope.
Wow.
But yeah, that was horrible. Absolutely horrible. We had, there's kind of the stereotype is that the FBI and local police or city police don't get along. And at least in Dallas, there could be nothing further from the truth. So there were actually, they call them task force officers, but there were Dallas PD officers that were embedded with some of our squads. And then every time that we'd do a SWAT operation, we'd use Dallas PD, sometimes just their uniform folks to block off the streets or establish a cordon from us, or if there were multiple targets, oftentimes we would take several of the targets in Dallas. SWAT would take some of the targets. And so we worked very, very closely and very, very well with Dallas PD. And so it was just a tragedy.
Mm. When did you know you wanted to write about stuff like this?
Yeah, so that's a good question. When I started writing my first military thriller when I was in the Army still, maybe around 2001 or so. And so it took me 3 books to figure out the people whose stories I really wanted to tell, because military thrillers is a big umbrella. And so what was lucky for me is that when I left the FBI, I went to work for a small company that was a veteran-owned company, and the majority of my coworkers were all from the special operations community. And so it went from people that I'd read about in books or seen movies to people who were my closest friends. And so one of those friends is a guy named Jason Beefley, who started in the Ranger Regiment and then spent the majority of his career in a Army Special Mission Unit. And his first deployment with that unit was for Gothic Serpent, which we all know as Black Hawk Down. And so there's a creed that governs Army Rangers. It's called the Ranger Creed, rather, and I'm going to butcher one of the lines. But the line says something to the effect of, never will I leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy, right? And so you and I sitting here, we're like, yeah, we can get behind that. I don't think we should leave fallen comrades. But to these men, it's more than just words on a paper. It becomes an oath that governs their life. And the way that this played out, that Jason helped me understand what that actually meant, is during Somalia, when the first or second helicopter was shot down, the Black Hawk was shot down, and the U.S. commandos reached the site of this helicopter. They're getting shot at by the Somalis, and they can see inside the helicopter that everybody's dead. They know there's no survivors. But they still, while they're under fire, grab every single fallen service member out of that helicopter to the point where they're using saws to cut pieces of the helicopter apart to make sure they can get every fallen service member. And so on its surface, that really doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you risk the living for the dead? Those guys are dead. Why would you risk your life to pull somebody who's already dead out of a crash? And the reason why they did that is because of the Rangers Creed, because they swore that oath to each other that I can't guarantee that you'll come back home alive, but by God, I will bring you home. And when he told me that story, I'm like, I've got to write about people like this. And I'm lucky enough to know a lot of them. And that's how my books changed from just being military thrillers to being the kind of books that I write now.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you make any mistakes in this book that you've been called on yet? I mean, not that I would know.
Man,
but,
look at you just poking me in the face.
I just know that, I'll do a story for PJ Media and somebody go, hey, that's actually not the proper acronym anymore. And I'm like, oh, God, okay. I try to check.
I don't. This one that I've gotten the most grief for, and this is, our fault or the marketing people. There are a lot of people who don't understand that it's a book where it went back in time, even though it says 2011. And so Kyle ended up killing several characters that are actually alive in this book. And so I've gotten quite a few angry. One guy's like, did you not read any of the books? How do you know this guy? But the biggest mistake that I get crap for all the time was actually my 4th Clancy book, Weapons Grade. And it has nothing to do with guns or vehicles or anything else. I made the horrific error of having Texas A&M play a football game on Sunday night because I needed it to work with the timeline. And I cannot tell you the amount of emails I get over that. So, my bad, people. My bad.
Yes, of course. Don Bentley wrote in the Tom Clancy universe with the Jack Ryan Jr. books. He has his own series of books, and of which we mentioned before. And you're just real talented. I don't know how you hold it all together, though. You've seen a lot of stuff, right? You've seen a lot of stuff. This has got to make you think back on times that were tough for you in the military. And in your book, this latest Capture or Kill, there is a character now developing a huge issue with flashbacks, mental issues, and that sort of thing. How do you keep it together?
Yeah, so I've been when you were joking about the FBI and me going on SWAT and kind of taking it down, I think in hindsight, looking back, part of that may have been a response to that bad day I had in Afghanistan and desperately trying to find a moment of significance again, and that it would go right this time. You know, that you can't get a do-over, but maybe if you're doing all these other things, you'll get a chance to do something right, and that will somehow balance the scales. And obviously life doesn't work that way. And so for me, I think what has been my salvation is my fellow veteran friends, like I said, guys, and in some regards, girls who could be Mitch Rapp or who could be Jack Ryan, and I get to tell them their stories, and I get to call them friends, and that's how it's balanced out for me.
So you do consider the profit and loss, if you will, that's even now, right? It's okay, sort of.
I think so. I think yeah, I think it's something. I don't think I would ever write a different kind of book, because I think you and I talked about it before. There's a character in this book named Mark Garner who was my next door neighbor in Germany. He was an infantry company commander, and he was tragically killed in Afghanistan. And so I put him in this book after getting his beautiful wife Nikayla's permission, because there's this old saying that says you actually die twice. And the first time you die is when you take your final breath. And the second time is when someone says your name for the final time. And so I thought, you know, if I can keep people like Mark Garner's name alive, then maybe I'm doing something beyond just telling a story.
Mm-hmm. You've used Shannon Kent's name, Joe Kent's wife, who died in an IED explosion, and many other people. And I noticed, though, that Scott Coleman has a new guy in his group. Tell me about Will. Can you talk to me about that guy?
Oddly enough, he has the same last name as me, Will Bentley. And so, yeah, it's crazy. So Will is my oldest. He's actually at Quantico now, going through the basic school. He got commissioned about a month or so ago as a second lieutenant in the Marines. And he has read all my books. He's my oldest. My oldest daughter has read one of my books, and my youngest daughter could care less about my books. And so at one point, Will came to me and he said, "You know what, Dad? You've actually had both girls, the cat and the dog, in your books at different times, and I've never been in your book." And so he is Scott Coleman's Marine for Capture or Kill.
It's pretty awesome. I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. Tell me about your homage to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in your book. At least that was what I saw. Was that what you were seeing?
Where are you talking about? I might be losing my mind.
It might have something to do with a waterfall, maybe. Or cliff into a body of water. By the way,
So
go ahead.
No, there's a couple things going on there. So one of the hardest parts of writing this book is that Vince Flynn loved Navy SEALs. And as someone who served in the Army, and all my friends were from Army Special Operations Unit, I have legions of SEAL jokes that I cannot use in this book because of how Scott Coleman and the fact that Vince loved them. And so one of my Ranger Regiment friends was actually wearing this t-shirt one day, and it had a Ranger, and in his arms, cradled like a little baby, was a Navy SEAL. And you could tell because you could see the SEAL's little fins and his tanks. And the thing across the t-shirt said, "Army Rangers, because Navy SEALs need heroes too." And I thought that was hysterical, but then I changed it a little bit at this point, where there's a scene where Mitch Rapp is rescuing an Army Ranger who's trying to convince Mitch to let him drown rather than be rescued by a SEAL and have to live that down for the rest of his day. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, go watch Butch Cassidy again, and you'll get a big laugh out of that. Big laugh. Irene was the guidance system to Rapp's smart bomb. Love that line of many in your book.
You.
Capture or Kill is the name of the book. Don Bentley is the author. And how many are you in for anyway? How many are we going to expect?
I can't talk about, you always ask the hard questions, Victoria. I can't talk about my contract, but I can tell you that I'm working on my next Mitch Rapp book right now.
Okay. And then I understand, so I've watched multiple interviews that perhaps you can't say anything, but perhaps you might be filling out the 3-story backstory of Mitch Rapp in a third Mitch Rapp, found origin story books collection. She tried to say.
I cannot confirm nor deny, Victoria, anything that I'm working on. So I really can't talk about what I'm doing next, other than it's another Mitch Rapp book. But nice try.
I like Greta, and I want that Paris cop Naveal to come back. I think she's pretty rad too. I mean, I'm not just about the chicks, because you know me. I mean, I love all the male characters in there, and those are the ones. But I mean, if you're gonna, pulling out the love interest, and if Claudia ever dies, which in the Mitch Rapp series is entirely likely, then there's always somebody. I'd like to see Mitch go back to Paris for a time. I'd like that. Yeah. I enjoyed that.
It actually is really interesting when you read or reread Vince's books, how many dangling threads he leaves in those books. And because I had to look at a whole bunch of that, because like we said, capture or kill just falls in the middle. And so I had to make sure I told a story that wasn't told, but then didn't do anything that would accidentally send ripples through the Mitch Rapp time-space continuum and upset the balance of the force. And so there was a bunch where you're looking at and you're like, did he never address this? He just moved on to the next book. And so there are a ton of cool little threads to pull, certainly. And the same thing with Kyle. Like Kyle, you and I have talked about this before. Like Kyle could have just written the next week's adventures of Mitch Rapp. And that dude not only was not content to tread water, but was not afraid to completely upset the apple cart from time to time too.
He really did. And I give him all the big ups that there are available.
Yeah.
Just because nobody went out and lynched him, because he did a great job. I mean, he really did. And I don't blame you for wanting to insinuate yourself in the origins, Vince's work, so that you can go and then create your own from there as well. Yeah. Well done. Don Bentley, I didn't know how you were going to do it, but you did. Number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list. I think it's destined for number 1. At least I'm hoping. And all the awesome. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. Well done. Thank you so much for coming on the Adult in the Room podcast again. Don Bentley, author extraordinaire.
Thanks so much for having me, Victoria.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Adult in the Room podcast. To keep the programs you like to listen to, please rate this podcast with a fantastic 5 stars on your Apple Podcast app every time you listen. And give me a great review. Plus, of course, subscribe to the podcast. It makes a difference with the big tech algorithm and the big tech oligarchs, and it makes us easier to find. Please get in touch with me on all the big tech stuff. Yeah, we're still there. Using the names Victoria Taft or the Adult in the Room podcast on MeWe, Parler, Minds, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks to 1ACast for imaging, editing, and production. The fantastic song is Gospel by the March 4th Band of Portland, Oregon. Music for Antifa versus Mike Strickland is Ride or Die by Raps by RC. The Adult in the Room podcast is also a production of Flamingo Road Studios. Remember, head up, heart out, and strive to be the adult in the room. Till next time, mischief managed.